That's it. Okay. Now, perfect. No echo? Great. That's misadventures of technology. So welcome to you all, and thank you to ACC lectures organizers. Here you have Giacomo, Ricardo, and Julia. There are a few of them missing, but they will show up later, I think. And we are here. I'm Francisco Diaz, also a PhD student here, and I was tasked with the amazing request to present or introduce Francesca Hughes, our guest today, who's we are really lucky to have her here in Torino for this lecture. Francesca Hughes, she's an architectural theorist and an educator who works at the feminist intersection of architecture, history, and science, history of science and technology. She has taught for over 2 decades, more or less, at the IA and the Bartlett in London, and she was also recently the head of the school at the UTS Sydney in Australia until, let's say, 1 or 2 years ago, more or less. She's the editor of the book, The Architect Reconstructing Her Practice from 1996, and author of this amazing book, which I have here. You can check it out later if you want. The Architecture of Error, Matter, Measure, and the Misadventures of Precision from 2014, and also Architectures of Prediction by Areku in 2019. And her current work in progress, The Architect's Computer, an Indiscrete History of the Universal Discrete Machine, explores architecture's indiscrete relationships to the project of computation. And in this lecture that she specially prepared for the call made by the curators of this series of lectures, Amate odiate la arquitectura, she's not only asking what's not to love architecture, but I think we will also learn that there's no chance of not loving Francesca afterwards. So thank you so much, Francesca. And the platform is yours. First, yours.
Francisco, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. And we got the feedback sorted, good. It's a great pleasure to be here. So thank you so much for the invitation. And I must say that, you know, you get different invitations, but when I got this invitation, it's so deliciously mischievous. I thought, yes, hating architecture. You know, that's what I've been doing for like 30 years, probably. All my work's about how to hate architecture, and to quote Hazlitt, about the pleasure of hating. So I thought, great, this lecture invite's completely designed for me. This is perfect. And then I thought, shit, it's completely designed for me. What do I do? And how on earth do I choose what to talk about? Because I could talk about everything that I've been thinking for the last 30 years, which you really don't want to hear, I'm sure. So I turned to the English expression, what's not to love? What's not to love has two meanings in English. What's not to love means, in the colloquial sense, is that something is unquestionably lovable. What's not to love about puppies playing in a field full of flowers, yeah? But the other sense, what is it not to love, presents us with an ontological question. What is the nature of not loving? Yeah. I'm going to need. We're back. Right. See if I can do this. This works. Okay, so as Francisco has said, I work increasingly at the feminist intersection between architecture and architecture's history of technologies, or the histories of technologies, the kind of entangled relations between the two. And throughout my work, there has been always a critique of the harm of reductive abstraction, of the way architecture particularly engages with reductive abstraction, and the violence that underpins its claim to autonomy, the loneliness, I'm going to argue, that it installs in our thinking. And this takes various forms. Recently, I've had recourse to return to a book that's now 10 years old, which is quite an extraordinary thought. And it's a book that considers the changes. It's the Architecture of Error that Francisco referred to just a moment ago, that considers the changes that took place between the beginning and the end of the last century, and to consider how much has changed for architecture and the world beyond in the last 10 years. So in a sense, I'm going to kind of return to this book, which itself looked at the beginning and the end of the last century. So in a sense, looked at 100 years. And this book is now 10 years old. So I'm thinking about how the last 10 years have changed and how the last 10 years actually changes the way we think about the previous 100 years. And so if we think, in a sense, what has changed in the last 10 years? And that might not be especially evident to a lot of you because you were probably in very different bodies 10 years ago, given your age. But 10 years ago, for instance, the truth was a stable construct. Our every thought was not yet framed by a necessary thinking about decarbonization and decolonization and its inseparability from techno-determinism. And equally, 10 years ago, techno-determinism itself was still raging in architectural schools, but its optimizing logics and their pairings with predictive technologies was yet to pervade every corner of our lives outside of architectural schools. So this lecture then looks at how these things, how in a sense, outside of the most extraordinary changes that have gone on in the last 10 years, there is a kind of pernicious and subtle change which relates to how thinking about techno-determinism that was raging in architecture schools 10 years ago has, in a sense, exited the school, but has entered every aspect of our life. And we can consider this in terms of 7 sins, architecture's 7 sins: chauvinism, appropriation, fetishization, repression, zealotry, vanity, and laziness as an alphabet of architecture's 7 hateful letters. So let's go through them. We start with C. C is for chauvinism. The one thing architecture has consistently produced through history as architects struggle with the troublesome heart of what architecture actually is the instructions as to exactly what architecture is and what it is not. The serial rappel à l'ordre in the form of treatises, letters, and books. And, one can kind of list through them: Vitruvius, Alberti, Delorme, Le Camus, de Maizière, Boulay, Lorgier, Rondelet, Semper, Viollet-le-Duc, Belager, Muthius, Wagner, Berendt, Gropius, and so on. And I'm sure you can kind of extrude that list since. At times we have responsibility, it seems, for all machines, timepieces, roads, temples, waterworks, sundials, military defenses. At other times we're responsible for none of these, but at all times we're subject to a disciplinary disdain, the non du père, that is not architecture, if we err from the current mandate. It is precisely the serial historic identity crisis of the architect that is architecture's shape-shifting impetus for renewal, all the while always loudly declaring itself immutable and not subject to doubt. So architecture is designed by its own self-doubt whilst it's busy declaring itself somehow outside of doubt. Thus, because architecture doesn't know what is proper to it, architecture is, of course, obsessed by what is proper to it. It is consequently a compulsive appropriator. A is for appropriation. It's also for amateurism. As consummate amateurs, we are always appropriating from other disciplines, indeed from others, in order to feed architecture's rapacious edge. That is, in order to furnish its oldest project, the future, via the production of the new. From critical theory to digital solutionism, our primary modus operandi is to steal and to repurpose. This serial thieving is always a confessional-like rehearsal of the foundational theft of architecture, of female generative powers. Listen to Philaret. I'm sure you've come across Philaret already. This is an amazing passage from Philaret. I'm going to read it through. As it is with man himself, so it is with the building. First, it is conceived using a simile such as you can understand, and then it is born. The mother delivers her child at the term of 9 months, or sometimes 7. By care and in good order, she makes him grow. Tell me, so it's a dialogue, so this is the other voice. How is this conception achieved? The first voice answers, the building is conceived in this manner. Since no one can conceive himself without a woman, by another simile, the building cannot be conceived by one man alone, as it cannot be done without a woman. So he who wishes to build needs an architect. He conceives it with him, and then the architect carries it. When the architect has given birth, he becomes the mother of the building. Before the architect can give birth, he should dream about his conception, think about it, turn it over in his mind in many ways for 7 to 9 months, just as a woman carries her child with her body in her body for 7 to 9 months. When this birth is accomplished, that is when he has made in wood a small relief design of its final form, measured and proportioned, the finished building, then he shows it to the father. Philaret continues, as I have compared the architect to the mother, he also needs to be the nurse. He is both the mother and the nurse. From Vitruvius's man to the propagative ambitions of Quatremère de Quincy's type, to Le Corbusier's modular, to the data-generating actors, let's see if this is going to move, yeah, in parametrically optimized flocking algorithms, the male body is deeply inscribed in architecture's harnessing of female reproductive powers that have serially underpinned each new architectural treatise, each new reproductive logic, be it the productive fertility of the line, concept to building, or of the loop, the network, and the algorithm. This harnessing is ancient. Zeus swallowed his pregnant wife Metis so that their progeny might not usurp him. In so doing, he also swallowed her craft. Metis represents not simply the name of the goddess of weaving in every sense of the word, as in to weave a fiction, but also the attendant powers of transformative intelligence and transformative materialization, both design and its delivery. The body and its matter, then, is not surprisingly, has always been feminism's default way back into architecture in its many attempts to recover the powers and reclaim metis, so most recently as feminist materialism, for instance. The late Anne Berggren is clear that metis is able to fold together truth and deception. Berggren is also clear that this legacy means that for a woman that makes objects, whether they be babies or buildings, this, quoting Berggren, this troping of the feminine creates a slimy mess, a situation that is paralyzing quagmire for women who make objects. Philaret's metaphoric autopoietic infrastructure paved the way for Francisco de Giorgio's staging of the navel then as a generative source of architecture and the generative source of the city, both in geometric terms, but also in material terms. That is, it is both the geometric origin and the nutritional origin of the city. Francesco de Giorgio. I therefore say that the first major piazza should be in the middle and the center of the city, or as near as possible, located as is the umbilicus in the human body. And the reason for this analogy is the following. Since human nature first takes all its nourishment and perfection through the umbilicus, so through the principal square, all other places of the city are nourished. As supply of material, Vitruvius's male navel then is recast as the female womb, or as if we are to buy into the metaphoric appropriation, as some kind of proto-placenta, to be precise. Although if we look at Erlach city over here, yes, that's working, it somehow appears to be springing not from his navel, but from his generative member. But architecture's autopoietic appropriation conceals barely the unstable relations to origin coordinates that anchor the sexual metaphoric acrobatics at play in its reproductive logics. Ironically, the navel as womb, the location point that pinned down Western architecture's home coordinates, and the generative geometric origin of all virtual and material line making that ensued, is, as the translator of Philaret John Spencer describes, strict, but rather vague. That is strict if one follows Vitruvius's instruction to the letter. Man fits perfectly in the square and man fits perfectly in the circle. Vague in that the center of man in the circle is his navel, while the center of man in the square is, as Joseph Reichwert so Englishly and discreetly puts it, his generative member. Cesarino's 1521 woodcuts of Vitruvius's bicentered men present both origin points as equally valid, apparently without conflict, suggesting that somehow navels and genitals are interchangeable, and within this schema, they are. Even if we overlook this inconsistency and stay with the navel as the center of the circle, this too is constitutionally unmoored. In a quiet aside in Philaret's treatise on architecture, he admits to the possible discovery, upon testing it with his compass, that the origin or center point is in fact adrift. In asserting all measure is derived from the human body and duly reciting Vitruvius, he adds, quoting Philaret, Vitruvius says that the navel is the middle of the figure of man. The navel would be the center point for the compass that would circumscribe man in a circle. From this, the circle derives. It is good enough reason to confirm our proposition that all measures are derived from man. However, it does not seem to be exactly in the middle, but the circle does remain round. So, in a sense, how can this be? What is a circle that's able to remain round whilst its compass point, its center point, is not exactly in the middle? If the navel is origin point and the center of the circle, the same navel's body describes, do not align, are we to assume some silent arrangement has been reached at the generative home of building? Do not think that as far back as this story may be, the trouble this dissimulated ambiguity constitutes is gone. It is not gone. Within the cybernetic machine that is increasingly central to the way we not only fabricate, but also the way we think architecture, is the body that has always been embedded in architecture's discourse of production, the reproducing body. The trope of motherhood is still turning within the epistemologies of architectural production. Vitruvius's navel is a generative origin point in space and time from which architecture begins its making. The coordinates that serve as reference point as the 00 for all subsequent coordinates in the drawing and then the materialization of building. Similarly, the homing of the machine or the robot at whose tool center point, be it via addition or subtraction or a combination of the two, a building now arrives, inevitably extrudes this legacy of dissimulated ambiguity. So when a robot is printing out a building or making anything, what it has to regularly, serially do is home back to a designated center point, home back in a sense to a navel, a 00, so that it knows where it is in machine space, slightly important. The navel is the home position to which architectural bodies must serially rehome so that neither line nor labor nor material get lost along their toolpath. Just as the projected and projecting navel in the basilica section, the church's plan, and the city's organization allowed the roof tile or the altar slab or the law court to figure out where they were located with respect to a global but ultimately hermetic geometric logic whose 00 anchored all, the homing of the machine or the referencing of the machine allows it to internally figure out where the end effectuator or nozzle head is located in machine space. Not only does the latter-day Vitruvian navel still determine all, it comes first. The first thing, for instance, a CNC router must do before departing down any fabrication path is to home itself so that it does not err along the way. echoing the covert ambiguity of the circle that's able to remain round whilst its compass point is not exactly in the middle, and the overt ambiguity of our bicentered men, the home position in robotic fabrication is usually not machine zero. In the case of a robot, the local center is likely to be the armpit condition or the elbow condition or even the wrist condition. Each a contextualized offset of the 0, of the robot itself that echoes the relations between the generative member, already a contextualized offset and adaptation for the square from the navel, if we're to accept the circle as the most fundamental geometry. Returning to Filaret again, as materialization of the building commences, the regime of the navel and nutrition becomes the new regime of that other origin, the generative member, and of desire, as Filaret's maternal love quickly becomes erotic. He writes, "Building is nothing more than a voluptuous pleasure, like that of a man in love. Anyone who has experienced it knows that there is so much pleasure and desire in a building that however much man does, he wants to do more. Sometimes he is never concerned with the expense. Examples of this are seen every day. When a man is in love, he gladly goes to see his beloved. When she is in a place where he cannot see her, he is not sorry for the time spent, nor is he bored. Where he can see her, he is not sorry for the time spent, nor is he bored." But is this love erotic or is it autoerotic? Mark Cousins reminds us in his spatial analysis of Freud's stages of the archaeological stratification of sexual maturation that sexuality stands for relations to object. With the third phallic stage, or the phallic stage being the third stage, arrives the pleasure of objecthood. He writes, "It is the moment at which the subject can take his or her own body as an object. It is the first time that the subject begins to recognize that I can be both subject and object for myself. I can be both a subjective wish for pleasure, and I can be the organ object which delivers this pleasure." In a curious inversion, then, of machine homing, Filaret's amorous architect returns and returns to the object of desire as if tethered to the pleasure it supplies, Filaret. So he who builds goes gladly to see his building, and as often as he sees it, the more he wants to see it and the more his heart swells. Time passes and he is never reluctant to look at it or to talk about it, exactly as the man in love talking about his beloved. There is no halfway for him, he loves it. Just as those working at the nozzles from which architecture now emerge are obsessed with the robot's depositions, and it's important to remember that Mark Cousins argued that the anus is the most important organ in the education of architects, but that's another story for another day. Our architect mother, turned to lover, is obsessed with his building. What then is the nature of this autoerotic obsession? F is for fetishization. Written during the digital turn, the architecture of error argued that a theory of error and concomitant rise of redundant precision had shaped architecture's 20th century and paved the way for the unchallenged ascendancy of parametric optimization at its close. That architects were operated under a not unconscious delusion, the logic that we assume organizes the relations between precision and its control of material error, and indeed its relations to truthfulness in architectural culture and production, had long since unraveled. Which is to say, when we draw a brick wall to 6 decimal places to be built on a muddy site with gloved hands, something's gone wrong, yeah? Precision clearly no longer does what it says on the tin. Its desires are on an altogether different course from their stated purpose. And precision's kiss, the glossiness, the shininess of extreme control it spoke to, has become the ultimate subject of architecture's fetishization. Best exemplified at that cathexis of the surfaces of architectural representation and the representation of architectural surfaces, the ubiquitous hyperreal glossy renders of the day. This is 10 years ago or more. What does it say about the insecurity of architecture's reproductive culture that when we got hold of the incredible computation power, we used it to produce very shiny drawings? How did a fear of error drive the rejection of organic materials in the unquestioning, indeed fetishistic embrace of the metallic ideal, interestingly also shiny, metal itself embodying in Corb's terms pure calculation that happened to produce a whole generation of aircraft too heavy to take off? That was architecture's fault. Architecture had exported to aeronautical engineering a metallic ideology that had then produced aircraft literally with wings so heavy that they could not fly, as they sacrificed all functional logics in pursuit of predictability. The engineered flightlessness of these airplanes is an incredible own goal for the instrumentalist premise. Here's a flightless aircraft. We find precision then to be yet another unspoken obsession of modernism, subject to fetishization and inflation and preserved by multiple institutional practices. Indeed, architectural culture's very special fear of error constitutes a powerful undertow in all its relations to the processes of materialization. Nonetheless, so this brick wall, again, let's come back to this brick wall that was once drawn with precisely judged approximation, has now become a methodological absurdity that nonetheless strangely does not seem to embarrass us. Quite the contrary, we exult in its redundant exactitude. Now we have upped that game. Redundant precision is ever more absurd. How then are we to understand the function of redundant precision in architecture? Konrad Waxman, whilst pursuing pre-digital precision beyond the limits of constructability, also claimed to be stripping architecture of all redundancy. Clearly, redundant precision somehow did not count. It is there to do what exactly? How much of it is about some other undeclared imperative that is not only driving the fetishization of the apparently precise, but also the reverse engineering at play in the construction of tolerance, materiality, and various other terms so central to architectural practice. Thus, the decorporalization of making, the printed building, resulting, of course, from the decorporalization of thought, from computation, induces a yet further crisis in architecture's already hysterical relations to materials and their manipulation. There is extraordinary craft latent in the wrestle of those who are engaging with engaging at the nozzle head with the robot, tweaking the algorithm, slowing the print, warming up the goop, cooling the goop, as they try to get it working, try to get it exactly right. But it's deliciously unclear now in whose body the craft now sits, and in whose body, indeed, the redundant precision now sits. For architecture 10 years ago, technological objects remain still autonomous things to fetishize, not the entangling agents they are now, difficult protagonists with complicated heritage, nonlinear histories, and suboptimal futures. With the notable exception, and I've got it up here, of Hake's Barcelona Pavilion, which was really ahead of its time, the Mises-rendered society. Written at the height of the digital term, the architecture of error in many ways anticipated what we now understand to be the imperfect term, a term that arrives to architecture from glitch theory. A glitch, like error, constitutes an interruption as it interferes with expectations and thus has the capacity to rip us from immersion, just as the shiny new metallic aircraft, too heavy to fly, suddenly ripped the aeronautical engineer from their immersion in the belief that everything was going to be metal, because metal could be optimized, because metal could be predicted, because it had linear behavior, and so on. Like all fetishization, the metal of the metallic ideology as a fetishized subject alerts us to a horrifying absence in its attempt to conceal a violent repression. R is for repression. Well before the material turn and its typically delayed uptake in architecture, as the typically delayed uptake in architecture of new materialism, Jennifer Bloomer had already described to us a lively material world of agency and kinship and complex capacities for co-production, including misbehavior. This was the material world the architecture of error was attempting to bring to bear on the very much less materialist regimes of Parametric optimization for once, aeronautical engineering, the invention of standards and specifications in the control of concrete, and so on. But also to bring to bear on the models employed to organize morphogenetic processes and biological reproduction, and the form and matter stories they tell. Parallel projection, causal linearity, metaphors, codes, lines, and loops, both domains, that is the instrumental premise or the material instrumentalism and reproductive morphologies, are important to us as architects because both play important roles in architecture's own epistemologies about its own autopoietic traditions and their repression of matter. In The Unbearable Being of Lightness, Blumer famously treats the erasure of matter as a proxy for the erasure of Mata, mother. She writes, what is at stake in the translation of a world into a diagram, into electronic impulses is, now you see it, now you don't. What disappears here? Mummy, that's who. Mata, not matter, so mother, may have been erased, but she left us trouble in the form of material error. Thus, any critique of our systems for the control of material error cannot but be feminist. In the last 10 years, thinking about matter through the questions of error has since allowed it to seg into the queer logics of errancy and that which evades definition in the infrastructures of value, important tools in our rewiring of the values that organize or that have to organize decarbonization and decolonization. That is the rewiring of, as Preciado listed it again recently in Dysphoria Mundi, plein, vide, sain, toxique, homme, femme, blanc, noir, national, étranger, culturel, naturel, humaine, animal, centre, périphérie, ici, là, analogue, numérique, vivant, morte, living, dead. It is a list that, if recited by Aristotle in the Metaphysics, the former terms would all have neatly been assigned to form, or what Aristotle called actuality, and the latter terms all to matter, or what Aristotle called potentiality. Manuel de Landa's 2015 introduction to the new materiality heroically declares, gone is the Aristotelian view that matter is an inert receptacle for forms that come from the outside. But I don't know which Aristotle he was reading, because the matter or potentiality described in Aristotle's metaphysics is already unreliably inert. It already has a tendency to make trouble, most keenly in bodies. From the beginning, matter was never truly inert, just under various regimes of control. And from the get-go, its worst behavior was found in the body, and the reproducing body at that. Thus, the reproducing body that still turns in architecture's own epistemologies remains an acute site for architecture to think through its material practice. But this also means that physical error embodies everything Aristotelian matter stands for, not a complex intersection of. And this list is from Aristotle, and it's extraordinarily relevant right now. Indeterminacy, these are all the properties Aristotle assigns to matter. Difference, and he's very specific. Difference is gender and it's race, but it's not species. Existence, interiority, process, and entropy. When things go wrong, it's because of matter. So it follows that any elaboration of error as a category is necessarily a critique of the interest precision is in service to. That is, the question of error is always unavoidably political. Aristotle's schema installs the questions we still do not ask. Can something be too precise, for instance? The properties we still fear, and the degenerate other that we still, while keeping it carefully hidden, conversely use to define what we are and what we do. The architect's engagement is, of course, not with matter per se, but with materiality under the auspices of the instrumentalist premise. But the architect has developed precocious tools for managing this unique fear of physical error. Collectively, these defenses ensure that almost any error that gets through is effectively neutralized. Two moments of material zealotry span the last century. 100 years before parametric optimization entered the architecture studio in pursuit of the miraculous potential of cheap and fast concrete buildings that could literally be poured into being, the construction industry embarked on the frenzied invention of standards and specification, and precision and error relations in architecture were reconfigured forever. Concrete then promised fast, cheap construction that eclipsed the laborer. Once the shuttering was in place, the drawing was just poured into being. And Le Corbusier was famously euphoric about this building that you just pour it into the shuttering and you come back from 3 days and remove the shuttering, it's there. But liquid, opaque, alchemical, recalcitrant, concrete also promised trouble. And what time is it? I want to check. Where are we at?
It's
1:05. Okay, great. Just because this computer is not on the right time. 1:50. Okay, great. Thank you. My clock's also wrong. Okay. So fear of concrete's fear of concrete, the desire to control concrete, this instantaneous, incredible material, drove a whole menagerie of splash dropping, ball tossing, needle dunking tests and the written instruments of its control, as the flood of slurry coming across America was matched only by the flood of the written word in hot pursuit of this recalcitrant material subject. Concrete brought about the invention of standards and specifications. As lab coats first walked into the site of the construction site to contain unruly slurry, obsessiveness peaked around the vexed question of wetness, liquidness. Not only did this affect a radical socio-political restructuring of the building site as cultural site, but also more curiously, the eclipsing of construction it set up. In the eclipsing of construction that it set up, it paved the way for much of the rhetoric around parametric optimization. And you may not be aware of this rhetoric, you may be blissfully unaware of this rhetoric, but some examples of this rhetoric that it's kind of surrounded the advent of parametric optimization was form is found, form arrives, you simply feed the data into the model, you manipulate the constraints, and in a sense, form kind of somehow arrives instantaneously. So again, as with poured in situ concrete, we find that there's this extraordinary eclipsing of construction. There's this eclipsing of the construction site. There's this eclipsing of the many that make the building. There's the eclipsing of the knowledge of the laborer and so on. And what's very interesting is the kind of imagery of flow curiously haunts both material systems and their epistemologies. The seamless flow of liquid delivered the physical instantaneity that prefigured that of digitalized construction. Thus, parametric optimization can be understood as a latter-day echo of the first static reception of that other equally miraculous, equally instantaneous, and apparently autonomous form-finding material system, Le Corbusier's flood of concrete. The zealotry that surrounded the repressive control of concrete and its laborers in the rendering of formlessness into form reminds us of the perilous middle phase of form production, when matter and error might hijack proceedings. Architectural culture has thus traditionally invested deeply in metaphors of reproduction, as we saw earlier, in order to hide the dangerous middle phase of form unresolved. So deeply that architecture twice interceded in the process in order to construct this kind of quintessential morphogenetic model. And they're both addressed in more depth in Architecture of Error. I'm just going to kind of race through it here. The first was in Samuel Thomas Sommering's Icones Embryonum at the very end of the 18th century, when the fetus, in a sense, was first drawn, not in perspectival space that had drawn all anatomical drawings up to that point, but in parallel projection in our space, in the space of architecture. The fetus or the fetal material was surveyed and measured and plotted as you would draw a building. And then in the next century, this is not what I wanted to do. Ernst Schrödinger, physicist moving into biology, obsessed with the kind of apparent anti-entropic properties of the gene, constructs gene action, gene theory, in which, in order to communicate the executive authority of his conceit of the gene, that scripts everything from cradle to grave, names the gene architect, invokes the metaphor of the architect in order to secure the supremacy of the gene. So these are two instances in which architecture jumps into biological reproduction and brings its space or brings its metaphor, which then obviously architecture, like all good colonizers, is doing this with its own self-interest, serves our need very well. Gordon Matter Clark somewhat uniquely understood that by turning morphogenesis inside out, temporarily as well as spatially, one is exposing something that is not to be seen in the first place. That was the thinking 10 years ago. So what is repressed now? If 10 years ago, the fetishization of redundant precision was symptomatic of the repression of matter, now the object of repression is transformed. While our relations to material precision have remained somewhat unchanged, if anything, we've become more critically aware of redundant precision, our relations to precision in the immaterial aspects of our lives, in the verbs, that is, rather than the nouns, have again witnessed a quantum increase. How we manage organizations, how we navigate, how we travel and transact, how we mediate, how we medicate, how we communicate are all fundamentally changed. Their change hangs on our transformed relations to chance. Big data-fed predictive AI has reorganized our relations to the future, arguably as never before. It's genuinely difficult to remember what existence was like before the floodwaters of big data had reached every corner of our lives, before data itself had become the new gold to the point that every interaction that we make is fed into an array of predictive models that would design our next tailored futures, the books we will read, the weather we will dress for, the routes by which we will navigate an unknown city or even a very well-known city, the food we will eat, and the people we will attempt to fall in love with. Our every turn must now be optimized. Big data is the legacy, of course, of 19th century moral sciences, statistics, replete with its eugenics impetus, come home to roost. To return to and to invoke in Hacking's ever-prescient 1990s book, The Taming of Chance, the now near quarantining of chance has transformed our relations to architecture's oldest design project, the future itself, via the formidable trinity of machine learning AI, big data, and data-driven capitalism. Although, of course, chance, like error, is by definition never to be conquered. Just as with the intensification of material intolerance in the 20th century, in which a no man's land kind of opened up between precision employed and error controlled, here again, a new no man's land has opened up between the future predictive systems designed for us, future events, profits, emotions, consumptions, transits, and what actually takes place. Instances when things don't happen as predicted, when things go wrong, can be understood as the 21st century echo of the airplane too heavy to fly, or Gene Action's metaphoric enterprise unable to explain the feedback and difference that eventually was its undoing and led to cybernetics. When things evade our predictive systems, we perceive them almost as something that's gone wrong. It wasn't meant to rain. I wasn't meant to be late. The phone said I would get here on time. An error that, like a glitch, makes us suddenly aware of the presence of a technology whose main objective it is to remain invisible. Computation uses most of its power to hide itself, to make us forget about computation, to get on with what it is that it's helping us to do. The spectrality of the glitch, its hauntology, that's Derrida's fabulous portmanteau of haunting and ontology, is defined by its ghost-like straddling between two realms, the evident and that which must recede or be forgotten. Similarly, the purpose of standards and specifications, of the many related instruments of practice, is to make us forget matter, is to make it disappear. Thus, when error erupts, matter with its haunting returns. Z is for zealotry. We are zealous. Two more sins. This is the penultimate sin. Precision as prediction then is still compliance. Not much has changed there. The extreme precision of these predictive systems, like all systems of precision, installs first an expectation of, and then second, a desire for compliance. The world in which error was written was largely unpredicted and thus suboptimal. It wasn't that world. Still cohabiting with chance, C.S. Peirce's being, living, unconscious, still uncomfortable with, but resigned to accommodating a certain amount of risk. We still had a sense of the now eclipsed present moment as an interval between the past and the future that had a perhaps deluded sense of autonomy from both. A present that was more than the space in which past predictions are confirmed and future predictions are announced, solicited or not, with a ping or a buzz. We understood, we did not think to question even, that the future was by definition somewhat uncertain and as yet to be discovered, a space of projection and speculative imagination in which things would unfurl. We would adapt as they did so. This was our skill. This was existence. Outside of parametric converts, determinism was viewed with a healthy degree of skepticism. You know, who was doing the determining? For whose benefit was it? That is, this world was not yet optimized. Indeed, optimization was an epistemic luxury, an aspiration that held sway only in certain sectors of certain domains, oil extraction from network shallow wells, for instance, or hedge fund and venture capitalist calculations, and of course also in architecture studios of a handful of dominant schools that had zealously signed up to its redemptive logics. The digital turn and the arrival of smart in its myriad costumes, from dumpsters to cancer treatments, arrived as if without a history. The rhetoric of parametric optimization and the evangelical discourse that celebrated it implicitly declared the end of history, as if the history of the project of computation, of thought and logic and memory disembodied was not as old as the history of architecture, as if their histories were not already complexly intertwined. As if Leibniz had not already determined calculation was to become the new truth that would decide and thus end all conflict, as the unmeasurable was to be exiled from the domain outside of this axiomatic paradigm. As if optimization had no history, as if precision had no history, as if extrusion of the early modern Enlightenment project was not simply seamless. This is yet another part of its immaculate conception and its promise of redemption. The digital was going to fix us again. It was outside of and therefore untarnished by everything that came before. In a post-critical decade of anti-theory backlash, optimization's proponents acted as if the end of history was to be taken literally, except, of course, it wasn't. Paradoxically, we now see that the digital turn brought not the end of history, but via the edible determinism of the many predictive and management systems we have used it to install that now effectively colonize our future as a space for profit secured and risk avoided, the end of the future. So if the future as architecture's oldest and longest project is architecture's oldest and longest project, this end of the future changes what we do. This changes our relations to error and precision, now reorganized around chance, compliance, and risk irrevocably. It's as if we've all taken up residence in an alternative reading of that famous Soviet joke, the future is certain, it is the past that is unpredictable. Parametric optimization's exit from the studios of many architecture schools that played with this curious new toy, it exited the schools only to be sublimated into the whole ecology of institutions, the whole system. It is the whole of society. It is in the water now, thus securing society's wider incorporation of techno-determinism and the digital solutionism it delivers. Yevgeny Morozov defines digital solutionism as big data deployed as the quick fix that eternally postpones addressing the root causes of a problem while systematically rejecting any political alternatives. So that is, digital solutionism is going to help us to fix anything but capitalism. Capitalism is out of the question. The optimizing doctrine that had driven the architecture of error's critique is in its sublimation apparently gone, but ever more present. So just as this kind of techno-determinism kind of went out of the school, into the system, into the water, similarly, feminist thought of the 90s, thought that had kind of underpinned some of the critiques that are around at the time, thought that in a sense could have resisted it, thought about material agency, about the messiness of entangled and embodied life, about non-conforming and dysphoric possibilities, about the particular that undoes reductive abstraction, was effectively excluded by the techno-determinist backlash of the post-critical decade, and has now, in its intersectional strategies, returned somehow also, hopefully, in the water, somehow more indistinct, more field-like, harder to pin down, and hopefully this makes it a more effective adversary for the ubiquity of digital solutionism, optimization's latter-day modus operandi. So if AI is our mirror, how are we to look at it without vanity? V is for vanity. We are vain. Architecture's historic attachment to causal linearity is because it delivers the myth of singular authorship, the project of rethinking causality. You know what? I'm going to jump vanity because we're going to run out of time. We're vain. We know it. We don't need to talk about it. But in a sense, what I was briefly pointing out with vanity is that precision is a white project. Accuracy is white, and it has been central to the colonial machine. And in a sense, we need to get to a point of architecture after narcissism. So let us conclude with L for last one and for laziness. And hang in there because it's also for love. So we're going to get to that. We're lazy. We are intellectually lazy. We have always been intellectually lazy. In 2017, in a joint interview with Zairo Paulo at the CCA, Charles Jenks declared, "We think with these diagrams," I'm sure you've seen Charles Jenks's diagrams, "you can't think outside of metaphor," he said. So his metaphors are obviously trees or rivers. But, you know, really, you can't think outside of metaphor. How is that? Animals seem to think outside of metaphor. I've certainly no children that think outside of metaphor. When did we become hostage to the lazy isomorphism of metaphoricity? This looks like that, so this can only be thought of in terms of that. You know, in a sense, that's the cage that metaphoricity puts us into. Now, of course, we must think with these things, with spreadsheets. So it's not much of a choice. You either get to think with metaphors or you get to think with spreadsheets. Spreadsheets that do not conjure but avoid the future, or to be more precise, they void the future. The central interest of their prediction is again compliance. For all its lightning speed and agility, its ever-growing list of functions, the management spreadsheet freezes possibility as it rehearses the sacrifice of understanding for predictive precision and instead blinds us with its transparency. This is the formidable rhetorical power. At the same time, the spreadsheet asserts that it is not a diagram, for how could it be? Diagrams have rhetorical agency. The spreadsheet propounds to have none. It's simply an organizational tool there to see what we cannot see, there to help us. Diagrams understand that there is a more complicated world out there. At least we hope they do. The spreadsheet replaces that world. That world never existed. The double power of the arch diagram that is the spreadsheet is predicated upon its insistence that it is outside of time, that it is not a diagram. So where did all our reductive thinking get us? Where did all our metaphors get us? The history of architecture is a litany of reductive, lazy modes of thought. But as we said, L is also for love. And we are most lazy in how we think not about the lives of architects, but the lives of architecture. So let us rehearse the laziness of our productive modeling, the easy isomorphism, the metaphoricity we see, install, and steal from everywhere, not least regarding generative powers. The architect is the navel, is the womb, Di Giorgio. No, the architect is the mother and the building is a baby, Filaret. No, the architect is a lover and the building is the beloved, Filaret again. So he clearly was confused. No, the architect is the type, Quatremer and Durand. No, the architect is the executive gene, Schrödinger. No, the architect is the designer of the probability machine, Charles and Ray Eames, the probability machine that basically scripts our lives. No, the animal is a machine of the copying of infinite regress, so the chicken is just the gene or the egg's way of making the next chicken. Norbert Wiener and Cybernetics, written in 1944. And expound through all of this, you will have noticed the Eameses put that probability machine that we just saw inside this egg for IBM. And here's a more local egg for you, an egg closer to home. No, the gene is a program tape, Jacob and Monod. So the architect then is a program tape. No, the type is a gene, Tony Vidler. So the gene is the program tape, is the type, is the architect. No, no, no. The architecture is the river that Jenks can't think without, but it can be a tree if you need it to be. No, architecture is code, concept is dead, so the building baby was alive, and the architect is a network. No, concept didn't die, and the network has become a tree named after a grasshopper. No, the architect is big data, and the exactitude of the inexact it inherits from 19th century statistics, and here's your spreadsheet. Preciado reminds us that Renaissance Enlightenment, an early modern miracle of the Industrial Revolution, depended on one thing, the reduction of slaves, women, and animals to reproductive machines, adding, if animals were at some point conceived of as treated as machines, the machines, little by little, became techno-animals existing among techno-living animals. Hazlitt argued, all love degenerates, only hate is immortal. But only that which has never been alive in the first place never dies. The necropolitical technologies, capitalist and colonialist practices that, to quote Preciado again, eroticize our relations with power and uneroticize our relations with the planet, convince us that we're not part of life, that we're not part of matter, that we were always at a distance, that we can only be at a distance. That is, that they convince us that we were never alive, never part of the whole system of life, never in an intimate engagement with everything else. This is the loneliness of architecture's reductive impulse, its desire for the autonomy of abstraction, its repression of matter, and all that is entangled in it, including us. So, if you care about architecture, let alone love it, it's important that you hate it in order to change it, because a thing that changes is a thing that is alive and that undoes necropolitical logics. Thank you.
It's working. Thank you so much, Francesca. It's really amazing presentation. I don't know if where to love or hate you now. I think the students start to get rid of their usual laziness, and because now you know that it's a sin, and start to thinking and phrasing the questions that they might have. I have one first question to start the conversation. I think, I mean, while I was listening to you now, I realized that most of your work has somehow to do with the sort of identity crisis within architecture as a field. And about the architect's insecurity about his or her own work. So how can you frame that? How do you see what may come after you acknowledge or we acknowledge around insecurities?
Mark Wigley wrote, I forget what, wonderfully a while ago, a long time ago now probably, about the kind of serial identity crisis of the architects. And, you know, it has two effects. That's what makes us so obnoxious, like insecure children, we're obnoxious, you know, confident, well, you know, child is not going to be obnoxious. But also it's that serial crisis that is our serial impetus for reinvention. The serial rappel à l'ordre, and then the serial erring away from it, and then the rappel à l'ordre. And, you know, that list I recited at the beginning, Vitruvius, Delorme, Camus, Viollet-le-Duc, you know, one can see it. You can kind of almost go through it. Rebel, rappel, rebel, rappel, rebel, rappel, all the way through. And in a sense, that is the kind of, that's the fuel in the tank. So, and these sins, as I've listed 7, but, you know, I could have listed 27. These 7 sins, in a sense, are a way in which architecture has kind of organized its insecurities.
A question for the audience. So, do you love or hate architecture?
Thank you very much for this presentation. So, straight to your question: do you love or hate architecture? In one part of my heart, I love architecture, but on the other part, I hate the way architecture is being done. And I think as architects, we are too concerned about our comfort zone. We love comfort. We just want to be there. We don't want to change. And you can see that most of the different industry go to engineering, medical field. A lot of revolution is going on. But when it comes to the architecture field, we want to remain there. And this attitude of being lazy or too in love with the tradition keeps us head back, hold us back instead of us to advance forward. How can we, for example, you talk about computation, how can we fasten the process? How can we take our life back? Because sometimes, especially when we do ateliers, design studios, you can see that we glorify, I call it the glorifying suffering. We don't want to change. Okay, this tool is not working perfectly. Instead of us finding the right tool to make our work faster or to make our work more prestigious, we just want to remain in the comfort of it. And they say, no, leave it like that. Or you don't have to change it. You have to love it. This is what was passed down to us. Just like you showed, the chicken passed everything down to the cheek. You know, we just want to. No, don't touch it. Le Corbusier said, no. So for me, I think that I really do not love this aspect of architecture, whereby you have to, Le Corbusier said, can we improve, do better, and introduce new things? What if, for example, there are architects that say, oh, I spent, or even students, I spent 20 hours making this drawing. Oh, I spent the whole day making this drawing. What if there is a possibility of speeding up the process? And for example, we have this new wave where we talk about artificial intelligence and how AI could be used to generate new concepts for architects. I see many people online, they will say, no, the people who use AI are the people who are very lazy to think about concepts. You have to leave you still need the human feeling, the human touch. The problem is, can't we move forward instead of us holding ourselves back, being afraid of the unknown? Can't we move forward? Can't we do things differently to make our life easier. For example, like as I stated before, people say, oh, I spent 20 hours making this drawing. What if you can do this drawing in 3 hours, reducing that amount of time, and you have the 17 hours to do what you love, or other things, you know? Thank you. I can talk about this all day. I don't know if
Thanks. Thank you so much. I think it's great, but I don't know if you want to reply.
But that's precisely what Le Corbusier said. I mean, he said, this is fantastic. I can bring a house into being in 3 hours if I pour it in concrete. I don't think we need to do things faster. I think the laziness I was getting at is our recourse to reductive, simplistic models. And so sometimes it's a metaphor, sometimes it's a spreadsheet, you know, sometimes it's an algorithm. And I think we need to actually do things in a way more slowly, in a more entangled way, and in a way that we, rather than resorting to reductive models that exclude the indeterminacy latent in the process, that we incorporate indeterminacy. We incorporate indeterminacy in the way we think about things, in the way we draw things, in the way we model conditions, that we operate at a kind of intimate distance, not resort to the brutal distance of that's kind of staged as part of objectivity, but actually a kind of intimate distance. I mean, you know, when the biologists that ultimately undid the idea of the gene that Schrödinger had installed and that and led to cybernetics are the ones that said, but hang on a minute, I'm not just projecting this metaphor, I'm actually looking down the microscope and I can tell you that cell is behaving differently from that cell. How do we deal with difference? And I can tell you that the chromosome is sending out this instruction, but there's a kind of other elements in the cell that are sending back further information. There's feedback going on. So difference and feedback are the two properties that undid the reductive control of the metaphoric thinking around the gene. And so in a sense that there's a kind of really interesting lesson to that, because there's a kind of intimacy of engagement with those biologists returning almost to a 19th century thinking where you would lovingly watch something and lovingly draw it, is to how do we bring that intimate distance or that dynamic objectivity, let's say. So we're shuttling between distance and proximity. We're shuttling between separation and entanglement into our processes. And I suspect it will slow us down. And that might not be a bad thing, because actually the kind of seduction of speed and instantaneity is precisely what was used to sell parametric optimization. But of course, actually writing those algorithms is incredible hard work, and it was never as fast as it looked. And actually the colleagues that grapple with the nozzles of robots trying to get the printout right, there's like 90 printouts you reject. It's never as easy as it looks, asking the robot to do it quickly for you.
I think we have time for one more question. So, yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. I've had the chance to take a look at your book, The Architecture of Error, and you present some ideas related to error and precision in architecture. First of all, the case studies of experiments in the book and also in the presentation are very interesting, especially in the way that they are related to architecture. I wonder about the initial inspiration for writing this book and the selection process of for these examples. Were there any challenges? And also related to the idea that errors can actually be generative. What would you suggest for the methods that architects nowadays in their practice should find this balance for the interpretation of errors and precision in their work for designing the built environment? Thank you.
Wow. Two questions, great questions, two big questions. So in the book, there are case studies that, let's talk about the case studies that are practitioners in the book, in a sense. So obviously there's half of the book looks at in the technology as a cultural construction, the other half looks at culture as a technological construction. But then across it, there are various artists that I decided to look at and point it, and of course, Georges Perec, who we will describe as an artist, but of course he's a writer. And they were selected carefully to be not architects, because one always needs to avoid the risk of being prescriptive to architects, to kind of say, this architect, do it like this architect is right. But then I spent a long time thinking about practitioners whose spatial practice, in a sense, already incorporated error, already allowed for difference, allowed for feedback, already incorporated a degree of indeterminacy. Rachel White-Reed just talks about, the moment of the pour, it's hands off, and you just let the liquid plaster or resin or whatever it is find its way and decide what the ultimate form would be. Matta Clark is obviously an incredible example of an artist who worked with zero redundant precision. So there were, and it's an interesting question, because it's interesting for me to think back to artists that I considered using, Gerhard Richter, and then I backed off, or Cristina Iglesias again, and then backed off. So it was a kind of interesting struggle to figure out who might be the artist who, and also in a sense, it was about finding artists who in their own writings had written about their technical process, as Hepworth had done. And it's not part of Barbara Hepworth, the sculptor that we know, talking about how you listen as you're carving to work your way around a flaw that you can hear in the marble. Regarding your second question, I guess the short answer is, what if architects could find a way to work more as these practitioners work? What if we could find a way to work with zero redundant precision, as Matta Clark works, to embrace risk as he works? What if we could find a way to work whereby we work with a kind of, again, intimate distance, as Hepworth does when she's listening to the stone? What if we could find a way to work in the way that Perec works, whereby he's playing a lot with a kind of parody of the loop, the parody of the kind of mad redundancy that's built into algorithmic thinking. Or Via Selmins is another kind of parody, isn't it? Because she's drawing as a machine would draw, and she's kind of working with this kind of indexical thinking, again, playing with precision. So I guess they all engage with a kind of critical thinking around precision. So, but, I teach studio as well. I never teach studio on this. I have no pre-cooked, instrumentalized error production formula, because in a sense, that would be precisely the kind of reductive conclusion that the book's trying to disarm. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I don't know. Are we okay if we open for one more question? You're the ones
Is there some other questions?
Well, I have another question for you, Francesca. What's the role, in your teaching and writing practice around architecture, what's the role of that the sense of humor plays within it?
It's the enormous role. It's really important, because humor, like love, undoes transactional logics. And architectural education increasingly is because it's taking place in universities, and because they're taking place within increasingly kind of optimized paradigms. everything must be measured. Everything, you probably do, well, perhaps you do encounter this as a student, but as someone who has once run a school, you're constantly having to measure everything, and that's because it's feeding into a kind of transactional thinking and transactional logics. So humor, like love, completely undoes that. It short circuits it. It throws that economy out the window. So it's incredibly important, and it's one of our most powerful ways of undoing the whole kind of necropolitical paradigm. Yeah, as Zizek knows well.
Well, I think that's a perfect way to finish this session. And I just wanted to thank you, Francesca, for this amazing, delicious presentation. And thanks to you all also for being here.